My cousin leaned back in the cracked leather chair of his office, a glass of whiskey sweating on the desk between us. He had that grin again, the one that always carried more smirk than smile, the kind that belonged to someone who believed himself untouchable. In his hand, he waved a stack of papers like a prop in some bad play. "She can't prove anything," he said, chuckling low. "Not a damn thing. His voice was thick with arrogance, his words heavy with the kind of confidence that only comes when a man thinks the room and the world bends in his favor. His laugh wasn't just aimed at the absent she, but at me too. He thought I was blind, thought I was tired, thought I was too old to notice the knife slipping between my ribs. I didn't answer. My silence was deliberate, the kind of silence that made him squirm for just a second before he leaned back further and poured another glass. The ice cracked sharply, like a hammer to glass. I let the sound hang between us. The contract sat on the desk, legal words, buried clauses, small print that he assumed I hadn't read. Truth is, I hadn't not then. I trusted him. Years of blood between us, decades of building together, I thought those things meant something. They didn't. Not to him. The office smelled faintly of varnish and old dust, the smell of an empire left too long in one family's careless hands. On the walls hung faded photographs, our fathers shaking hands, construction crews posing beside steel beams, men in hard hats proud of what they'd built. I was in half of those pictures, younger, shoulders straighter, hair darker, eyes still sharp with ambition. Now I sat in front of him, 63 and worn from a lifetime of early mornings and late nights, carrying the kind of exhaustion that settles in the bones. I'd given more to this family than anyone, and still, here I was, listening to my own blood laugh about how little I mattered. I studied his face as he drank. He'd grown soft around the edges too many dinners, too much liquor, too many years, letting others do the hard work while he counted the money. His suit was sharp, but his eyes were lazy, unearned confidence behind them. He thought my silence meant surrender. He mistook composure for weakness. He always had. I remembered the first job site we stood on together. A winter morning, the ground hard as stone, my breath fogging the air. He'd shown up late, wearing gloves too fine for work and boots too clean for mud. I'd been the one to show the men how to pour concrete in the cold, how to set rebar so it didn't snap under stress. He had been the one to shake hands with the inspectors, to charm the clients. We were a strange pair, me with the dirt under my nails, him with the slick smile. But back then I thought it worked. I thought we balanced each other. That morning replayed itself in my mind as I listened to him boast now, decades later. His voice had grown smugger with time, his reliance on me heavier. Yet somewhere along the line, he'd convinced himself it was his hand that had built everything, not mine. "You really ought to learn to relax, Richard," he said, setting the papers aside as if they were nothing more than scrap. "You're too uptight about this business stuff. Leave it to me. That's why you signed everything over in the first place, isn't it?" My jaw tightened, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reply. Because the truth was, I had signed. I had trusted. I had walked into this office months ago, handed a stack of documents, and been told it was routine, just paperwork to simplify accounts, just signatures to keep the business smooth. I hadn't asked enough questions. I'd been tired, my hands aching from years on scaffolding, my back stiff from carrying more than my share. I thought, foolishly, that family meant trust. It was trust that had gutted me. Later that night, long after I'd left his office, I sat at my own kitchen table, the papers spread out under the yellow glow of a weak lamp. The wood beneath my elbows was scarred, worn from years of coffee cups and bills, but the documents in front of me were slick, unreadable at a glance. My eyes burned as I traced the words, legal terms, property rights, distribution of assets. Clause by clause, I began to see what he had done. He had stripped me out of ownership. Piece by piece, he'd carved away what was mine, until I was little more than a ghost in the business I'd spent my life building. He had reduced me to nothing but a name on old photographs, a story whispered at family gatherings, a man too tired to fight. And he had laughed while he did it. The sound of his laughter stayed with me that night. It wasn't just amusement, it was contempt. He believed I couldn't fight back. He believed age had dulled me, that years of labor had left me too worn to lift a weapon. But my weapon was never rage. It was patience. I closed the papers and sat still in that kitchen for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Outside, the winter wind scraped against the house like dry fingers. I thought about the men who had worked under me, men who had relied on me to keep jobs safe, who had trusted me with their wages. I thought about my father, who had told me once that blood was only as strong as the hands that honored it. And I thought about my cousin's smirk, that wide, lazy grin. I didn't feel anger, not in the way he expected. What I felt was clarity. He thought I was finished. He thought my silence was an ending. What he didn't understand was that silence is where beginnings live. I poured myself a cup of coffee, black and bitter, and let the steam rise into my face. My hands, calloused and scarred, curled around the mug. I remembered every nail I had driven, every beam I had set, every house I had raised from dirt. I knew how to build. I also knew how to dismantle. And I knew, without question, that my cousin's laughter was the first crack in his own foundation. The papers on the table weren't the end. They were the blueprint. I started with paper. Paper doesn't panic. Paper keeps time better than memory, and it doesn't care who laughs. The county clerk's office opens at 8. I was there at 7:30 with a thermos and a folder that had grown heavy with years. The lobby smelled like floor wax and old envelopes. A man set down a mat near the entrance, the rubber slapping tile. I nodded. He nodded back. No rush, no drama. I asked for certified copies, deeds, amendments, anything with my name or my cousin's. The clerk stamped dates with a dull thud that shook the counter a steady heartbeat in a quiet room. By 9, I had a timeline. The original partnership, the later simplifications, the transfer that cut me down to a polite ghost. There it was in black ink, with notaries and embossed seals. I didn't feel shame. I felt direction the way a surveyor feels the pull of a line. I drove home slow, hands loose on the wheel. The winter light skimmed the frozen river like a blade. In the glove box were carpenter's pencils, ground down by years of marking cut lines. I used one to circle dates in the margins of the copies while I waited at a red light. January, April, June. The pattern wasn't artful, it was lazy. He had counted on me being tired. He'd been right then. At my kitchen table, I laid everything out like forms on a job site before the pour. You don't rush concrete. You don't rush this either. I made columns. What he took, what he promised, what he failed to deliver. The pencil smudged my fingertips gray. When the phone buzzed, I let it. The world could wait for once. I called a lawyer after sunset. Not the kind with billboards. The kind who answers with your name because she was taught to listen first. Evening, Richard, she said. Calm voice, no varnish. We'd met years ago on a zoning dispute. She'd warned the room 3 times, in 3 different ways, to read the footnotes. I remembered. I need certified copies reviewed, I told her, and I need to know what he thinks he owns. Bring everything, she said, and bring how you got there. I liked that. She knew the route mattered. Her office smelled of tea and paper, the good kind of paper, thick enough to take ink without bleeding. She read without a sound, lips pressed flat, as if keeping counsel with the words themselves. She asked for a timeline. I gave it, date by date, no extra seasoning. She tapped one clause with a forefinger. He assumed your consent carried over from the prior agreement, she said. But his simplification created a new instrument. He needed a fresh acknowledgement from every partner, not just a signature on a cover sheet. He papered speed as continuity. Speed is how he lives, I said. She flipped a few more pages, then sat back. 2 avenues. 1, we attacked the last transfer outright rescission for failure of consideration and for material misrepresentation by omission. 2, we let him ratify the holes in his own paperwork. That requires patience and a witness who cannot be browbeaten. The record. Ratify, I repeated, tasting the word. It felt like a level resting true on a beam. She nodded. We give him what he always wants, something to sign, not a trick of clarification. The kind a prudent business owner would read. If he doesn't read, it's not on you. We disclose, we memorialize, we notarize, we record. And if he signs blindly, then he's told the court who he is, she said, folding the documents into a new stack. You won't raise your voice. The paper will. I walked out with an action list written in her deliberate block hand. Not big moves. Small ones in order: request vendor compliance affidavits, update indemnification language, prepare a management acknowledgement with attached Schedule A that restates duties and ownership splits under the older framework, the one before he simplified. A merger clause, venue and fee shifting. No deception. Just the path of a careful man with time. I slept 2 hours that night, deep and clean. When I woke, the light in the kitchen looked like the pale cloth the painters lay down before they taped the trim. The house felt expectant, empty of noise and full of decision. I sent my cousin a message at 8 sharp. We should get ahead of year-end filings. I've got a banker asking for updated management acknowledgments and indemnity forms. We can knock it out in 20 minutes with a notary. True enough, the bank would ask eventually. He liked the sound of banker. He liked the sound of anything that came with doors that revolve when you walk in. He wrote back at 8:03, "Fine, bring whatever. I've got a call at 9:30. 27 minutes. You can build a lot of truth in 27 minutes." I reserved a small conference room at the copy shop 2 blocks from his office. The kind with glass walls and a printer that hums like a content machine. I told the clerk I'd need a notary at 9. He said, "Sure thing," without looking up, then slid me a pen tied to the counter with a beaded chain. The world is held together by beaded chains, by people you don't notice until you need them. He arrived 2 minutes late, scarf loose, breath clouding in the door. "This quick?" he said, already bored, already reaching for his phone. "Quick," I said. I'd placed the documents in a neat stack, tabs bright and obvious. The first page read, "Management and Risk Acknowledgement." The subtitle said, in plain language, that each party had reviewed the attached schedules, that prior agreements were superseded by the restatement below, that all parties affirmed full understanding of duties and ownership as outlined. A normal person reads that. A careful person reads the schedules. My cousin was not careful, not today. He scanned until he found the line with his name and space for his grand signature. The notary, a man with patient eyes and a sweater too big at the wrists, asked for IDs. We produced them. He recorded numbers slowly, pen scratching like a soft saw through pine. The printer purred out copies. The room smelled faintly of warm paper and toner. I could hear my cousin's fingernails click against his phone case as he tapped a message to someone who mattered less than this. "Initial each page," the notary said, pushing forward the neat stack. My cousin sighed like a child. Whatever. His initials looked like a lazy river after a drought, shallow and quick. He didn't turn a single sheet to read the schedule behind it. He didn't ask why the indemnification language was now bilateral instead of one way. He didn't notice the merger clause, the fee shifting, the venue. He didn't see Schedule A restating the pre-simplification splits and expressly rejecting the later transfer absent full performance and audited consideration. He didn't have time for that. He had a 9:30 call and a grin to wear for it. When he finally looked up, I watched his face for a flicker of recognition. Nothing. He handed the stack back, as if it were a menu he'd finished with. "You good?" he asked, already standing. "Good," I said. The notary stamped the last page. The sound was orderly as a hammer landing square on a nail head. The camera above the copy counter blinked a red dot that said recording. The clerk slid us the extra sets, rubber-banded and warm. I thanked them both by name. Names matter. On the sidewalk, my cousin checked his reflection in the window. "You really should relax," he said again, a reflex line. The way some men say hello to their own pride. "All this paper. You get one life, you know?" I looked at him at the perfect knot of his tie, at the crease running down his trousers like a chalk line, and felt an old tenderness pass through me, brief and honest. Family is what we keep telling ourselves it is, until paper reminds us what it isn't. He clapped my shoulder, hard enough to pretend at warmth. "We're done here. Send whatever to accounting. I'll file the copies," I said. "You do that," he said, and he walked back toward his building, phone at his ear, a man convinced every door was automatic. The file clerk at the county office recognized me on site by the afternoon. He smiled when I slid the envelope forward. "Back again," he said. "Getting ahead," I said. He stamped what needed stamping. The thuds sounded like a steady rain on a flat roof, dependable, unsurprised by weather. When he handed me my certified copies, the acknowledgement, the schedules, the notary's embossed seal pressed deep like a thumbprint, I didn't feel triumph. I felt accuracy. On the way home, the sky loosened, and a thin snow began to sift through the air. Not enough to stick, just enough to lace the edges of things. I thought about beams and loads, about what carries and what collapses, about how weight moves through a frame. You can hide rot under paint for a long time. You can't ask it to hold. At the kitchen table, I aligned the new stack beside the old. Past on the left, present on the right. My father used to do that with tools, the ones you inherited and the ones you bought yourself. You measure life by what you keep in reach. I brewed tea because coffee felt like noise. Steam rose in a thin, clean column. I read every line again, then again, tracing the edges with a carpenter's pencil until the wood wore flat against the paper. Somewhere down the block, a plow scraped once along the curb a metal sigh. I turned off the overhead light and read by the lamp, which cast a clear circle on the table, while everything outside the ring fell quiet. What happened that morning wasn't revenge. It was framing, it was level, it was square. It was a man who once signed in trust, telling the record who he has become. The kind of man who reads the footnotes, who brings a witness, who respects the weight of a stamp. My phone buzzed around 9. A message from my cousin. Banker loved the call. We're moving fast. Don't fall behind, old man. A smiling emoji followed, like a sticker slapped on a cracked bean. I didn't answer. I filed the papers in a drawer that sticks a little, the way true drawers do in old houses. I slid it closed with the heel of my hand and waited to feel either fear or relief. Neither arrived. Just the steady hum of the refrigerator and the soft pulse of the house breathing in winter. People say you can't hear ink dry. They're wrong. If you listen closely enough, you hear what it becomes. I blew out the lamp and let the room go dark, all but for the small square of streetlight. On the wall, a pale mark, shaped like an open door. In that shape, I could almost see the courtroom's wood grain and a judge's hand lifting a page. The blueprint was no longer in my head. It was on the record. Next, I would let him keep laughing long enough for the paper to finish speaking. That night, I pulled out one of the old photo albums. My wife had arranged them years ago, leather-bound, corners curling. Pictures of me and my cousin at job sites. Him in pressed shirts, me in coveralls. Him shaking hands, me bent over plans. Looking at those pages, I saw the story written clear. A lifetime of division. He took the credit, I took the weight. He took the stage, I took the ground. And now he had the audacity to laugh, to waive a contract, to tell me I couldn't prove anything. What he didn't understand was that I didn't need to prove to him. I needed to prove to myself that sacrifice hadn't been wasted, that the years of building hadn't ended with me erased. I closed the album and sat in silence. The house dark but for a small lamp. The air smelled faintly of dust and pine old wood, old years. My father's words came back again. A man's word builds the roof. His work holds the beams. My cousin's word had rotted. My work still held. I realized then that this wasn't just revenge. It was reclamation. Not of property alone, but of the truth of who had built what. And so, as spring warmed the air and snow melted from the gutters, I began preparing not just for court, but for memory. For the day the record itself would speak where my silence had lived. To remember each one, not to dwell in bitterness, but to line them up, straight as fence posts. The first stone, the years I worked for less than my share because he said the business needed flexibility. I carried the load of payroll in lean winters, paid the crews on time, even if it meant my check came late. He never saw the nights I sat at the table with an empty envelope, promising my wife it would balance out. The second stone, the equipment I bought with my own savings when the company account ran dry. Compressors, saws, scaffolding. I told myself they were for all of us, for the family name. His signature went on the receipts, mine on the checks. The third stone, the clients I calmed after his mistakes. A developer once threatened to sue after he cut corners on a strip mall foundation. I drove 3 counties over to meet the man myself, shook his hand, promised to make it right, and then spent 6 weeks rebuilding what should have been solid from the start. My cousin never set foot on that site again, yet in the papers it was his project. One by one, I traced these stones on paper, attaching them to dates, contracts, old invoices I kept tucked in a drawer. I wasn't building a story for sympathy. I was building the history of who carried weight and who just carried himself. The lawyer smiled faintly when I brought her the folder, thicker now, heavy with evidence that didn't weep or shout, only recorded. "You've kept everything," she said, flipping through receipts as if handling relics. "Everything that mattered," I answered. She tapped her pen. "This is your ledger. Courts respect ledgers, especially when the other side has only laughter." It was the first time in months I felt something like balance return. Still, there were nights when memory tried to drag me under. I'd wake at 2 in the morning, the house quiet, and walk to the kitchen for water. The floorboards creaked in old, familiar ways. And I'd remember years when I came home late, boots muddy, hands raw, shoulders stiff. My cousin would be at some dinner with bankers, raising a toast to our success. Those memories didn't sting anymore. They sharpened. They became the steel rods inside the concrete of my resolve. In early summer, I visited one of the first houses we ever built together. It sat on a side street, white paint peeling now, shutters hanging loose. I parked at the curb and stepped out, standing on the cracked sidewalk like a ghost revisiting his own work. I could still see the beams under the siding, still feel the weight of each joist we'd set. I remembered sweating through my shirt as I lifted trusses while my cousin leaned against a post, chatting up the inspector. The house had aged, but it stood straight. My cousin's words hadn't held it up. My work had. That realization steadied me more than any court paper. Back at the lawyer's office, we began drafting motions. Not aggressive, not loud, just precise. She explained each clause the way my father once explained tool care. This one cuts. This one protects. This one looks simple, but saves the most. We won't accuse him, she said, her glasses low on her nose. We'll let him accuse himself. The record is already in your favor. All we need is his signature in the wrong place. And he's shown us he can't resist signing without reading. I nodded, picturing his hurried scrawl, the lazy curve of his initials. He had always been too quick with pens, too eager to be finished. He never understood that patience is its own hammer. Weeks passed. My cousin went on, oblivious, still laughing at barbecues, still boasting at family gatherings. He'd slap my back in front of uncles and aunts, saying things like, "Richard doesn't worry about the details anymore. I handle that now." I'd smile faintly, sip my iced tea, and let the words hang in the air. The others would laugh with him, some politely, some nervously. They thought my silence meant agreement, but silence, when held long enough, becomes a weight others can't measure until it drops. At night, when the house settled around me, I would sit with my father's old hammer. It was heavy, the wood handle worn smooth from his grip. I didn't swing it anymore. Arthritis made sure of that, but I held it across my lap like a relic. That hammer had built more homes than I could count, driven nails into beams that still held decades later. I realized my revenge wasn't about crushing. It was about building a structure of truth, patient and square, until the weight of it collapsed on my cousin's arrogance. The final stone in my ledger was the simplest: trust. I had given him mine again and again, and he had turned it into leverage. That was the core wound, the one that bled longer than any contract could measure. But now trust was gone. What remained was precision. As I filed away the last stack of certified copies that summer, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not even satisfaction, just the steady knowledge that the record was no longer his to manipulate. It was mine. And when the day came, it would speak louder than his laugh ever could. The day betrayal finally showed its full face. It wore a suit too expensive for honesty and a smile too wide for family. My cousin called a meeting at the old headquarters, the one our fathers had built brick by brick, when they were still young enough to swing hammers side by side. "Richard," he said, gesturing me toward the long table as if he were the host and I the guest, "we need to discuss the transition plan. You've done your part. It's time to let the next generation take the reins." The room was bright with morning sun, but the words landed like shadows. Transition plan. Next generation. Done your part. He said it like a eulogy, like I was already gone and buried, and all that remained was the reading of what little I had left. I sat, folding my hands on the table. They were still scarred from years of work, veins raised like roads on a map. His hands, by contrast, were soft, the nails too neatly trimmed. He placed them on the polished wood as if laying claim to the entire table. "You'll still have a place, of course," he continued, smiling in that way he did when he wanted to soften a blow with sugar. "An advisory role, honorary. The men respect you. But legally, well, we need clarity. Investors want clean lines. Honorary." That word cut deeper than any contract. It meant, stand quietly in the corner while I run the show. It meant, your decoration now, not foundation. I didn't answer right away. My silence stretched long enough that he shifted in his chair, glancing at the others in the room, two younger managers, both of whom owed their paychecks to him. They looked down at their papers, pretending not to listen too closely. Finally, I said, "Clarity is important." His smile brightened. He thought I agreed. That night, I sat again at my kitchen table. The same table that had borne the weight of my father's elbows. The same table where I'd signed documents in blind trust. I laid out the minutes from the meeting, written hastily by one of the managers. Words on paper, once more. Transition plan. Advisory role. Legally, we need clarity. I traced each phrase with my fingertip. My cousin thought this was the moment he won. He believed he had cut me out, not only from ownership, but from identity. He thought he had taken my name from the company, the way a carpenter pries nails from old wood. But he didn't understand that nails leave holes. Holes tell stories. A week later, the betrayal deepened. I received a letter, printed on letterhead, that still bore both our names, but written as though one of those names was already fading. It informed me that effective immediately, I was relieved of operational duties. It invited me to continue attending ceremonial functions to honor the legacy of our fathers. It thanked me for my decades of loyalty, and promised a gracious transition into retirement. Retirement. The word tasted like ash. My body might have slowed, yes, but my mind had not dulled. I could still see a crooked beam from across a yard. I could still spot a clause that bent the wrong way. The letter was betrayal, dressed in polite phrases. It was the kind of document written to bury a man while keeping him quiet. But paper cuts both ways. I folded it carefully, slid it into the same folder where I kept my cousin's earlier contracts. The record was growing fat with his arrogance. Family dinners became theater. My cousin would raise a glass, boast about the company's new direction, and drop sly lines like, "Richard's finally getting to rest after carrying us all those years." Laughter would follow, some genuine, some nervous. I'd sit in silence, eating slow, listening. My cousin's children, teenagers, now would glance at me, half curious, half dismissive, already absorbing the story he spun. The story where I was the tired old man fading into the background. But I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I didn't shout my truth into the noise of their clinking glasses. I simply observed, and as I observed, I took notes. Dates, phrases, witnesses. A record not of emotion, but of fact. One evening, after another dinner where his laughter rang too loud, my wife asked me quietly, "Why don't you ever speak up?" I looked at her at the lines that years of patience had etched into her face, at the eyes that had watched me work myself nearly to the bone. "Because words vanish," I told her softly, "but records remain." She didn't press. She just nodded, as if she understood that I was no longer fighting for applause or recognition. I was fighting for permanence. The betrayal reached its cruelest edge when he began speaking to the men the crews I had trained, the ones who had followed me on ladders and trusted me on scaffolds. He told them I had stepped aside willingly, that I had grown too weary for the work, that I had wanted him to lead. Some of the younger men believed it. They had only ever known me as the older figure walking the sites, correcting small details. They thought maybe I had grown soft. But the older ones, the ones who remembered sweating beside me at dawn, they said nothing. They just looked at me with quiet eyes when we crossed paths in town. Those looks were enough. They told me the truth wasn't forgotten, not completely. The sting of betrayal was sharp, but it wasn't the kind that drove me to anger. It was the kind that sharpened patience into steel. Each slight, each lie, each arrogant smile was another nail in the coffin he was building for himself. He thought he was erasing me, but what he was really doing was writing the preface to his own downfall. I let him talk. I let him laugh. I let him sigh. And in the quiet of my kitchen, under the hum of the old lamp, I let the paper gather weight. Betrayal has a way of echoing. It doesn't land once, and fade it lingers, like the ring of a hammer striking steel, long after the tool is set down. My cousin's betrayal was no single moment. It was a series of echoes. Each week, each gathering, each letter, he found a new way to remind me that he thought the company was his, and that I was nothing more than a relic. One morning, he stood at the podium in front of the men. I wasn't meant to be there, but old habits die hard. I'd driven by the yard early, just as the crews were gathering. He was dressed in a crisp navy suit, polished shoes shining against the gravel. The men shifted uneasily. Some had tool belts slung low, others held coffee in styrofoam cups. He raised his hands and said, "Times are changing. We're moving forward. Richard has stepped aside to enjoy his retirement. He's earned it. Now it's time for new leadership, new energy, new vision." The words rang false, even to him, I think. A few men nodded, but most stood in silence, boots scuffing the ground. Their eyes glanced toward me where I stood at the edge, half-shadowed. My cousin didn't look my way. He didn't dare. That silence from the men, that was the echo I listened for. It told me they hadn't forgotten. Later that week, I received another letter. This one came not from my cousin, but from a lawyer with his signature at the bottom. It outlined terms of a transition package. A stipend, an office for ceremonial purposes, access to the company Christmas party, as if that was what decades of sweat were worth. I laid the letter on the kitchen table. The wood groaned under my elbows as I leaned forward, staring at the words. They tried to turn me into a guest in my own house. I didn't tear it up. I didn't curse. I slid it into the growing file. Another piece of his arrogance recorded in ink. Family, meanwhile, had begun to repeat his story. At birthdays and reunions, whispers circled like smoke. Richard's tired. Richard's ready to rest. Richard passed the reins to someone sharper. They looked at me with a pity I didn't need, a pity I hadn't earned. I didn't correct them. Not yet. Because when a lie grows too tall, its fall makes more noise. The hardest cut came from my cousin's own mouth one night when we crossed paths outside a diner. He had just finished a meal with a banker, laughing too loud on the sidewalk. He saw me and grinned that lazy grin. "Rich," he said, clapping my shoulder. "You should thank me. You've got peace now. You don't have to carry all that weight anymore." Peace. As if betrayal was a gift. As if being erased was freedom. I looked him in the eye, steady, calm. "You always did think weight was a burden," I said quietly. "You never learned it was what made the beams hold." He laughed, dismissing the words as the ramblings of an old man. He walked away, shoulders loose, certain the world bent his way. But I carried that moment home like a tool. His laugh, his dismissal, they were nails in the structure he was building against himself. That night, I dreamed of scaffolds, of climbing beams under a gray sky, the wind cold, my hands steady. I dreamed of looking down and seeing him below, calling up, asking if it was safe. And I dreamed of saying nothing, letting him climb on his own into a place where the weight was too much, the support too thin. I woke before dawn, the dream still ringing in my chest like a warning bell. The betrayal no longer stung the way it once had. By now, it was familiar, like a scar you learn to live with. But familiar scars can become tools. They remind you where the weak spots are. They remind you what to reinforce. I began keeping a journal not of feelings, but of facts. Dates, times, names, words. Every insult, every false claim, every attempt to bury me under polite phrases. It wasn't rage that drove me. It was record keeping. I was a builder. This was just another frame to measure, another wall to keep square. My cousin never noticed the way I listened more closely, the way I wrote things down. He mistook my silence for defeat. He mistook my stillness for exhaustion. But silence was my hammer now. Stillness was my level. One evening, as summer bled into fall, I sat at the kitchen table with the folder open wide. Contracts, letters, minutes, notes, each page a beam, each signature a joint, each clause a nail. Piece by piece, I could see the structure forming. And in the middle of it all was the lie he told most often, the one he believed the deepest, that I couldn't prove anything. That lie was the weakest beam in the whole frame. And when it snapped, the collapse would echo louder than his laugh ever had. I closed the folder, slid it back into the drawer, and leaned back in my chair. Outside, the night was cool, the stars sharp. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, then fell silent. I let the quiet settle around me, heavy and steady. He thought the story was finished. But the truth, the real story, was only beginning to rise. There is a rhythm to construction. Measure twice, cut once, fit the beam, check the level, secure it with nails. Revenge, I found, follows the same rhythm. You don't rush a frame if you want it to stand. You let each step cure before you place the next. My cousin thought the game was already over. He strutted through meetings, told anyone who would listen that I had stepped aside gracefully, that I was enjoying retirement. He mistook silence for absence. What he didn't understand was that silence is the sound of concrete curing. You can't hear it, but it's hardening all the same. I began my countermove not with the confrontation, but with questions. Quiet, small ones. I asked a banker for copies of our old loan agreements. I requested subcontractor affidavits from 3 years back. I pulled invoices from vendors who had dealt with both of us. No one thought much of it. An old man keeping records, they assumed. Let him tinker with his paperwork. But each page I gathered slid neatly into place, another board across the frame. I wasn't trying to bury him with paper, I was trying to let the paper speak for itself. One evening, I sat with my lawyer in her small office. The windows looked out over Main Street, where neon signs flickered and a steady stream of headlights passed. She spread the documents across her desk, tapping them into order with a deliberate hand. Your cousin was sloppy, she said. These filings contradict each other. This transfer references accounts that didn't exist at the time. This indemnity clause binds him, not you. I listened, silent, the way I always had on job sites, when men younger than me thought they were explaining something new. It wasn't pride that kept me quiet, it was patience. What do you want to do? She asked finally. I looked at the papers, the signatures, the careless strokes of my cousin's initials. I want him to tell the court who he is, I said. She nodded. Then we'll let him. The next step was simple on the surface. Create a new acknowledgement. Not a trick, not a forged line, but a restatement, one that included every clause he had ignored, every schedule he had skipped, A document that clarified the ownership split according to the original structure, the one our fathers had built before he began his simplifications. It was careful, transparent, legal, and it was bait. I knew my cousin's weakness wasn't greed alone. It was speed. He never read what bored him. He signed to get back to his phone calls, to his dinners, to his laugh. All I had to do was give him paper that looked routine and wait for his impatience to reveal him. So I arranged a meeting. Nothing formal. Just two cousins, some paperwork, a notary. He showed up late, as always, scarf loose, smile wide. "What's this?" he asked, already glancing at his watch. "Bank needs updated acknowledgments," I said. "Keeps the books clean. Nothing major." He chuckled. "You and your paperwork. Fine, let's get it done." He didn't read. He never did. He initialed where the tabs told him to, signed where the line waited, shook the notary's hand, and left in a hurry. The stamp thudded on the page. The ink dried. Another beam set. That night, I placed the new document in the folder. On the left were the betrayals. Contracts that erased me. Letters that mocked me. Signatures that stole from me. On the right was the acknowledgement he had just signed, clear and square, reaffirming what he thought he had taken. I sat for a long time, staring at the contrast. My cousin believed he had buried me under fine print. What he didn't see was that the same tool he used to erase me could also restore me if I had the patience to let him use it against himself. In the weeks that followed, I kept my silence. At family gatherings, he still bragged. At meetings, he still strutted. At dinners, he still laughed. But I watched the weight shift. I could feel it in the room even if no one else did. It was like standing under a beam you know is cracked. Everyone else walks under without noticing. You feel the give in the wood, the way it bows under stress. You know, one day, without warning, it will give way. One Saturday, I walked past one of our newest projects, a bank branch rising on the edge of town. I leaned against the fence, watching the crews. They were good men, careful, skilled, but they lacked something I used to give them: oversight. I saw a ladder set at the wrong angle, scaffolding missing a brace. Small details, but dangerous ones. It struck me then how similar the site looked to my cousin's paperwork. The frame stood, but it was crooked. The weight was misbalanced. From a distance, it looked fine. Up close, it was ready to fail. I turned away, the wind cold against my face, and thought, let him build crooked. Let him smile. The collapse always comes from within. At home that evening, I sat with my wife. She asked me gently, "When will you tell him what you're doing?" I shook my head. "I don't need to tell him. The judge will." She studied me for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "Your father would have liked that answer." I thought of my father's hammer, still sitting on the shelf in the shed, its handle worn smooth by decades of use. He'd always said, "A tool doesn't need to shout to do its work." Neither did I. I poured myself a glass of water, carried it to the window, and looked out at the quiet street. The houses stood solid, beam square, roof steady. I thought of every nail I had ever driven, every board I had cut. The work always outlives the worker. That was the truth my cousin never understood. And soon the record would show it. Paper has weight if you stack enough of it. One sheet can be ignored, a dozen can be waved off, but when the file grows thick enough, it becomes something you can set on a table with a thud. That was what I carried into the clerk's office one Monday morning. Not anger, not demands, just weight. The clerk knew me by now. He smiled when he saw me, asked how the family was. I answered with the same calm tone I always used, sliding the folder across the counter. He flipped through the stamped copies, checking seals, initials, notarizations. Each page in that file was ordinary in isolation, but together they told a story. A man cut out, a cousin careless, a record corrected. When the clerk stamped the final sheet, the sound echoed in the quiet office like a nail-driven square. Another beam set. My cousin, of course, knew nothing of this. He was too busy shaking hands at luncheons, boasting to investors, talking about streamlining. He stood in front of rooms full of strangers and claimed he had modernized the company, made it his own. At one of those luncheons, he even said, loud enough for family to hear, "Richard's a good man, but the world moved past him. He's just glad to let me handle things." I was there, sitting in the back. His eyes never even met mine. He didn't notice the way the lawyer beside me made notes on her pad, recording his words. He didn't notice the silence that followed his laugh, how it hung too long in the air. He thought silence meant agreement. He still hadn't learned silence can be a witness. At home, the folder sat on the table like a second guest at dinner. My wife would place plates beside it, smile faintly, and ask me nothing. She understood. She knew that each page, each seal, each signature was not just preparation, it was reclamation. Some nights I would take out my father's hammer and lay it beside the folder. Two tools, one for building houses, one for building cases. Both carried weight. Both could hold or break depending on how you swung them. As autumn deepened, small cracks began to show in my cousin's confidence. Subcontractors complained that payments were late. A banker quietly mentioned that documents my cousin filed didn't match the ones in their archives. A supplier sent me an invoice, asking if I still had authority to approve it. I answered each with calm words, "Check the record." And when they did, they found the signatures, the acknowledgments, the notarizations. They found clarity where he had only offered haste. The first time my cousin realized something was wrong, he called me late at night. His voice was sharper than usual, the laugh gone. "Rich, what the hell did you file?" I held the phone steady against my ear, listening to his breathing quicken. "The truth," I said simply. You blindsided me." His words stumbled, unlike him. "Do you know what you've done?" "Yes," I said, calm as water. "I know exactly." I didn't wait for his reply. I ended the call. Silence can be louder than any argument. From that night on, I saw him less at family dinners. When he did come, his smile was strained. His eyes darted to me and then away. He no longer clapped my back or made jokes at my expense. The room noticed. Whispers shifted. Pity drained away, replaced with curiosity. I stayed silent. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. The paper spoke in my place. One evening, I walked past the courthouse. The windows glowed warm against the autumn dark, casting long shadows across the steps. I paused there, hands in my pockets, watching people file in and out. I imagined the day when we would both stand inside. My cousin, with his grin, finally cracked. The judge reading aloud words he had signed without care. I didn't feel triumph at the thought. I felt inevitability. Like watching a wall bow under weight you know it can't hold. Collapse isn't dramatic when you've measured it. It's simply the next step in the design. At home that night, I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table. The folder lay open, pages neatly aligned, seals crisp. I traced the lines with a fingertip, steady as a carpenter checking the grain. The countermove was complete. The frame stood. The weight was ready. And all that remained was for gravity, the steady pull of truth, to do its work. The courthouse smelled of old varnish and paper. A high ceiling carried whispers upward, where they tangled with the echoes of footsteps and the dull groan of benches. I had walked into many buildings in my life, houses still skeletal with framing, barns half-roofed against storms, schools where children's laughter would one day echo. But this building had a different weight. Its beams weren't wood or steel. They were rules. They were the record. My cousin swaggered in as if he owned the place. His tie was knotted too perfectly, his shoes polished like mirrors. He greeted the bailiff by name, cracked a joke with his lawyer, and glanced at me only long enough to smirk. "She can't prove anything," he muttered as he passed, the same line he had said months ago in his office, whiskey glass in hand. He still believed it, or maybe he needed to believe it. I sat quietly at my table. No smile, no scowl, just steady. My lawyer beside me flipped through our file, the same file that had grown heavy in my kitchen, page by page. It sat there now like a block of stone, ready to anchor the truth. The judge entered. The room hushed. Papers shuffled, chairs creaked. My cousin leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping the wood as if he were bored already. He thought this was another formality, another step where his grin would carry him through. The opening arguments were brief. His lawyer painted me as a tired old man, confused by contracts, clinging to a business that had already passed me by. I listened without blinking. I had heard worse in whispers at dinners, in laughter behind closed doors. When it was our turn, my lawyer stood and spoke calmly, her voice even and deliberate. "This case is not about confusion. It is about clarity. It is about a signature, freely given, under full acknowledgement. It is about the record." She placed the thick folder on the desk with a thud. The sound filled the room like a hammer strike. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. The judge asked for the most recent acknowledgement, the one my cousin had signed, blindly, hurriedly, impatiently. The clerk handed it up. The judge adjusted his glasses, smoothed the page, and began to read aloud. Each word landed steady, like nails driven in sequence. Ownership reaffirmed. Prior transfers void without full performance. Duties and responsibilities restored. Fee-shifting provisions in case of dispute. Clear, plain language that any careful man would have read. I watched my cousin's face as the words unfolded. At first, he smiled faintly, confident, as if waiting for the catch. Then the smile faltered. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened. By the time the judge reached the clause that stripped his simplification of its power, his lips had gone pale. The courtroom was silent, save for the judge's voice. And in that silence, my cousin's arrogance cracked. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I simply folded my hands, feeling the smooth scar of an old blister across my palm. That scar had come from lifting a beam too heavy for one man, years ago. My cousin hadn't been there that day. He'd been busy charming a client. I had carried the weight alone. Now, here in this room, the weight shifted back where it belonged. When the judge finished reading, he looked over the rims of his glasses at my cousin. "You signed this?" "Yes," my cousin said quickly. Too quickly. His voice carried a note I hadn't heard before strain. "You did so before a notary?" "Yes." "And you initialed each page?" "Yes, but—" "There are no buts," the judge interrupted gently. "The record is clear. You affirmed the terms. You cannot now claim otherwise." My cousin opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in years, he had no words. I sat still, watching, remembering every moment that had led here. The laughter, the whiskey glass, the dismissive claps on my shoulder, the letters thanking me for my service. All of it had built to this quiet collapse. The downfall wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a man realizing too late that the paper he had ignored was the very rope tightening around his ambition. After the session adjourned for the day, I walked slowly down the courthouse steps. The autumn air was crisp, leaves scattering across the stone like pages turned by the wind. My cousin trailed behind, phone pressed to his ear, voice sharp and panicked now. No laughter, no smirk, just strain. I paused at the bottom of the steps, looked up at the sky streaked with fading light, and let the air fill my lungs. The trap had sprung, the first crack had sounded, and though more hearings would follow, though papers would still shuffle, though arguments would still echo, I knew the weight had shifted for good. The courthouse became a second home that autumn. I didn't speak much there, I didn't need to. My lawyer handled the words, the record handled the weight. Each hearing was another hammer strike, another nail set deep. My cousin's lawyer grew sharper with every session, his tone edged with desperation. He tried to paint me as confused, tricked, deceived. But each time, the judge would lift the document, stamped and sealed, and ask the same question. "Did you sign this, Mr. Halberg?" And each time, my cousin had no place to hide. His yes came quieter with each repetition, as if the word itself was draining him. Outside the courthouse, the cracks widened. Suppliers began calling me directly again. "We're not sure who has authority anymore," one said, his voice low as if confessing a sin. "But your name is on the acknowledgement. The bank confirmed it." The bank, once his stage, his playground, now looked to me. A loan officer called to ask for clarifications on payments, referencing clauses my cousin had ignored. I didn't boast, didn't scold. I simply answered with precision, sending over certified copies. Paper, once more, doing the work. My cousin's smirk, the one he had worn like armor, disappeared in public. He still showed up to luncheons, but his laugh no longer filled the room. Investors began to drift from his side, gravitating towards silence, toward me. At a family dinner, he tried to raise his glass, but his voice cracked. "To Richard," he said stiffly, "for keeping the history alive." The table clinked politely, but no one laughed. The shift was subtle, but I felt it. Pity had turned into curiosity, and curiosity was turning into respect. I stayed quiet, chewing slow, letting the moment speak for itself. The real collapse came not with shouting, but with numbers. In court, my lawyer presented ledgers, payments missed, debts ignored, obligations my cousin had signed off on but never met. Clause by clause, the judge traced the failures back to him. "Mr. Halberg," the judge said finally, "it appears you not only misrepresented these transfers, but also failed to uphold the duties you claimed to assume." My cousin stammered, reaching for excuses that slipped like sand through his fingers. His lawyer objected, protested, waved his arms, but the judge's tone was final. "The record does not lie." I watched my cousin sink back into his chair, his shoulders sagging, his face pale. For the first time in decades, he looked smaller than me. That night, walking home under the orange glow of street lamps, I thought of my father. I imagined him standing beside me, nodding once, saying nothing. He would have understood. He would have known that revenge isn't fire, it's weight. Quiet, steady, undeniable weight. At home, I set the folder on the table one last time. It was no longer heavy. The work was nearly finished. The beams were set, the frame secure, the roof ready to hold. Weeks later, the judgment was handed down. Ownership restored, transfers voided, fees shifted. My cousin was left not with laughter, but with debts. The company he thought was his alone now stood balanced again, my name etched firmly where it had always belonged. He walked out of the courthouse ahead of me, shoulders bent, phone silent. He didn't look back. I didn't call after him. I didn't need to. The record had spoken. That evening, I sat in my shed, my father's hammer across my lap. The wood was smooth, the head dark with age. I ran my thumb along the handle, thinking of every nail it had driven. I realized then, revenge had never been about crushing him. It was about building back what was mine, square and true. It was about proving, to myself most of all, that silence is not surrender. Silence, when held long enough, becomes a foundation. And when the judge read that contract aloud, my cousin heard what silence sounds like when it finally speaks. The courthouse door closed behind me, and for the first time in years, I felt the air lighten in my chest. It wasn't joy, not exactly. It was something quieter, steadier, like a beam settling onto its foundation, no longer carrying strain. The judgment had been read. The contracts he waved like weapons had been stripped of their teeth. My ownership, my dignity, restored not with shouts, not with fists, but with the steady rhythm of clauses and signatures. My cousin had walked out ahead of me, his shoulders bent, his voice gone. I hadn't needed to follow him with words. The record had followed him enough. At home, my wife greeted me with the same calm smile she always had. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. She saw it in my face the long fight had ended, and the silence I had carried all these months had finally spoken. We ate dinner at the kitchen table, the one where so many nights I had sat with papers spread beneath the lamp. The folder was gone now, filed where it belonged, its work finished. For the first time in years, the table was just a table. Plates, forks, steam rising from a stew. No stamps, no seals, no signatures. I ate slowly, letting the quiet fill me. The next morning, I drove past one of our older projects, a library we had built 30 years ago. Children filed in with backpacks, their voices bright against the stone steps. I parked and walked to the sidewalk, running my hand along the brick. It was straight, steady, still holding after decades of storms. I thought of my cousin then, how he had always chased applause while I had chased square lines. The applause faded. The lines endured. That was the truth he had never understood. Work outlives noise. Weeks passed. My cousin grew quieter in town. He still appeared sometimes at the diner, at church, but he no longer boasted. The smirk was gone, replaced by a tight jaw and tired eyes. People still greeted him, but their voices carried a different weight now. Respect had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just shifted. I didn't rub it in. I didn't need to. The collapse had already echoed, and echoes don't need repeating. One afternoon, as autumn tipped toward winter, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee. A neighbor walked by, nodded, and said, "Heard about the case. Good for you, Richard. You handled it the right way." I nodded back, nothing more. Inside, though, I felt something like gratitude. Not for the compliment itself, but for the fact that the truth had finally found its way out without me shouting it. Silence, once mistaken for weakness, had proven itself. I began to walk the old job sites more often. The school on Pine Street. The houses on Maple Avenue. The barn out on the county line. Each stood square and true, beams still carrying weight, nails still holding. I remembered each cut, each lift, each day when the work was heavier than I thought I could bear. And in each I found reassurance. My life's work was still standing. My cousin's words had never built any of it. One evening my wife asked, "Do you feel satisfied?" I thought for a long moment before answering. "Satisfied isn't the word," I said. "It's settled." Because satisfaction implies triumph, and I didn't feel triumphant. I felt level, square, like a wall finally aligned after years of being out of plumb. The file was locked away. The judge's order was filed. The men in town knew the truth. My cousin knew it too, whether he admitted it or not. I had no need to revisit it. My silence had already spoken. That night, I went into the shed and picked up my father's hammer. I held it in both hands, the weight familiar, the wood worn smooth. I tapped it once against the workbench, a soft sound, steady and final. A tool doesn't gloat when the job is done. It simply rests until it's needed again. So did I. Winter came quietly that year. Snow dusted the roofs of houses I had built long ago, softening their lines but never weakening their frames. I drove past them sometimes, slowing at corners, watching how the eaves still held against the wind, how the windows glowed warm at dusk. They were proof, standing there in silence. Work done right endures. My cousin's voice, once loud in every room, had nearly vanished from town. He still lived there. I saw him now and then at the grocery store, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floor tiles. The man who had laughed over whiskey, who had clapped my shoulder with arrogance, now moved like a shadow, trying not to be seen. I never said a word to him, not out of cruelty, but out of respect for the silence between us. Some things are finished when they are finished. People ask me sometimes how it felt to win. I told them I didn't win anything. I only reclaimed what was mine. Winning suggests competition, a race, a prize. This wasn't that. This was correction. This was balance. And balance doesn't shout. It simply stands. In the evenings, I returned to my shed. The hammer still sat on the bench, its head dark, its handle smooth. I would pick it up, feel the grain of the wood against my palm, and set it down again. Not to build, not to strike, but simply to remind myself of weight, of steadiness. The hammer didn't need to prove it could drive nails. It already had. I didn't need to prove myself either. The record had done that for me. My wife once asked, "Do you regret the years you stayed quiet?" I thought long before answering. Number, because silence is where patience lives, and patience is where truth grows strong. She smiled then, the kind of smile that doesn't need words. The last time I saw my cousin up close was at a family gathering, months after the judgment. He stood in the corner, glass in hand, speaking little. When our eyes met, he looked away first. Not out of fear, not even shame, but out of recognition. He finally knew that silence hadn't been weakness. I didn't walk over. I didn't need to. The distance between us said everything. Now, when I sit at my kitchen table in the quiet evenings, I sometimes hear echoes the laughter he once aimed at me, the arrogance he wore like a suit. Those echoes don't sting anymore. They sound hollow, like tools dropped on empty ground. What remains is the sound of the judge's voice, steady, deliberate, reading aloud the contract my cousin had signed blindly. That sound will outlive laughter. That sound is the echo of silence speaking. I live simply now. I walk past houses, I nod to neighbors, I drink my coffee slowly. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just the steady rhythm of a life built square and level. And if anyone asks what I learned, I tell them this. Silence isn't surrender. Silence is patience. Silence is the sound of concrete curing, of beams settling, of truth waiting its turn. One day, if you hold it long enough, silence will speak. And when it does, it will echo louder than any laugh. The story ended not with shouting, not with triumph, but with a man me sitting in the calm of his own house, dignity intact, shoulders lighter, knowing that patience had been my sharpest tool. And that was enough.